Today I have two guests in Fri Tankes podcast. It's actually Professor of Philosophy Torbjörn Tännsjö and Professor of Bioethics Peter Singer. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. First of all, I know that you have known each other for quite a few years, but what brought you together now in winter Stockholm, December 2021?
Yeah, I'm entirely to blame for that. I mean, it's because of a prize I won from the Swedish Council on Bioethics, where I was allowed to arrange with the conference, effortless, as I said. It's rare for an academician not being forced to bother with practicalities, and so I could just say who should be invited, and they invited them. And Peter here, of course, was my first choice to this seminar. So that's why Peter is here in Stockholm right now.
I was very honored to be chosen to be invited for this, and also you were able to find a time when I could do it, which I really appreciate. So it was a great pleasure to participate in this special conference about Torbjrn's work, specifically the work about resource allocation in healthcare and in the situation of the pandemic. Of course, that's been a very current and important debate. So I was really pleased to be able to come here and take part in that session.
So let's talk about that a little bit. What are the bioethical issues in a pandemic time? I mean, if you define the major problems of ethics here.
Well, in my opening statement, I defined some problems I wanted to be solved during this conference, so to speak. And of course, one basic one is how priorities should be set in a situation where there are not ventilators enough for everyone, and so who should be catered to, who should be left behind. So there are principles that suggest answers to these questions, and we have a special situation in Sweden where we have state regulation from the parliament, which seems to contradict practice and I would say common sense, and also suggestions from the National Board of Healthcare and social sciences, social services, I think it's called, going in a more utilitarian direction, so to speak. What is required that we should really flip a coin if a young and an old person compete for the same resource. So I mean, that is perhaps the main problem, I think, because it also relates to how we distribute resources in more ordinary circumstances as well.
Yeah, that was the issue that I focused on in the presentation that I did with my co-author, Katarzyna de Lazary-Radek, who's a Polish philosopher. So we were particularly concerned to support the idea that we should make decisions not simply that save lives, but that actually save life years, so that people with a greater life expectancy would get priority over people with a shorter life expectancy. And we wanted to push back against some ideas which say that everybody must be treated equally, as Torbjörn just said, that you would have to flip a coin in certain cases where clearly you would do more good if you didn't flip a coin, but you chose the person who had either the expectation of living longer, or perhaps the person who, let's say the scarce resource is a bed in the ICU or a ventilator, who would need that ventilator for a shorter time, so that the ventilator might save several lives, whereas if you put somebody else on the ventilator who was predictably going to need it for a longer time, it might only save one life. So we wanted those kinds of factors to be taken into account, whereas some bioethicists appeal to this idea that it's a violation of human dignity if you give priority to somebody because of some of their characteristics, like their age or other factors that might affect their quality of life.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the Swedish position is to flip a coin, basically.
I mean, the legal position, the decision made by the parliament indicates that that's what you're supposed to do. But of course, no sane person would do that in the ward, and there was also support for a different idea. But those directions came under strong criticism, of course, by people believing in the dignity doctrine.
And you had this seminar on this the other day, and
yes.
And did you have people there opposing to that, opposing to your view here?
Yes, indeed. I mean,
what are the arguments?
Well, it's boiled down very much to this. I mean, I think there are two ideas. One is this idea about dignity, where I argued that they could really do without it because they have more clear normative views that could be expressed without reference to dignity. And then I think one idea is this, which is also called the equity view, that everyone should given an equal chance of being saved when life is at stake. And I think that's a hopeless idea, really. It makes sense in some restricted settings where you have two people competing for the same resource and there is no medical or other differences between them. But it leads to absurd consequences if you sacrifice many people in order to maintain the equal chances for everyone to be saved, for example, or when the example that Peter just gave about how you set priorities in the ICU context.
Well, we certainly did have people taking a different view. We had Dr. Lara Palazzini from Italy, who's a member of the Italian National Bioethics Committee. She was online rather than in person. But she was defending the view that we shouldn't make these distinctions, and on the basis of human dignity, as she put it, as Torbjörn just said. Maybe you could have restated that argument without that concept, but I think the fact that people do state it in terms of human dignity is really a kind of a secular version of the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, or something of that sort, that we are all special in a way that no other non-human animal is special, and that somehow is something that overrides these other practical characteristics, as how many years can you expect to live? Are you severely demented so that you wouldn't really enjoy your life consciously even if you did live? It's kind of this belief in human dignity becomes, as I say, like a secular way of putting this idea that, well, you still have an immortal soul, you're still made in the image of God, and therefore we must treat you equally.
I must ask you, Peter. I mean, Sweden is a fairly secular country, but you teach at Princeton in America, and as we all know, there are quite strong conservative religious Christian groups there. How are they reacting when you talk about these things?
Well, when I first came to Princeton in 1999, there were strong protests from people about my appointment. Some of them were disability groups who didn't like my views about parents having the option of euthanasia if they gave birth to a severely disabled newborn infant. Some of them were religious groups, of course, Catholics and other Christians. And there was also opposition from one of the Princeton Board of Trustees, Steve Forbes, who at the time was running for the Republican nomination for president, which eventually went to George W. Bush. He didn't get it anyway. But he attacked me, I think, because he was himself liable for being attacked by people who said, hey, you're on the Board of Trustees and you didn't stop the appointment of this person who, is such a radical that he not only believes in abortion but also in euthanasia, and even euthanasia for severely disabled newborns. So he was one of my critics. But after I'd been there for a few months, that all calmed down and those protests went away. There are some conservatives at Princeton who hold these views, but they're a relatively small number. I think the American academic life, particularly in the elite universities, is much more on the liberal side of issues like abortion, and generally on the Democrat side rather than the Republican side. If you go to some places in southern states, of course, you might get different views, or in the Midwest, but not at Princeton. So I don't really have any problems with teaching these issues.
But one could think that you might have more problems today because of the emerge of canceling culture in America, where they sort of say that students should not be offended by controversial ideas. But you haven't experienced that yourself.
Not really. I think to the extent that I have, it is from people who are concerned that people with disability might be troubled by what I say about allowing parents to opt for ending the life of the severely disabled newborn, because they feel that may have the implication for other disabled people that it would have been better if they were killed. That's not my view. Certainly anybody who's capable of making that decision for themselves, I fully respect the autonomous decision that they make. But I think, I do think in general that infants have a different moral status from those later people who can make choices about their life, and that the difference between terminating a pregnancy because you've had prenatal diagnosis and it shows that your child will have a disability, and most people, most Americans too, will terminate a pregnancy if they're told that their child will have a serious disability. And in my view, the difference between doing that during pregnancy and doing it immediately after birth is not a great morally significant difference, because in both cases you have somebody who's not really aware of their situation, hasn't really got their life started in a biographical sense. And so really my view is more about the status of the infant than it is about the idea that disability is always a terrible thing, which, sometimes it may be, sometimes it may not be.
Torbjörn, have you experienced the cancel culture in Sweden recently?
No, not recently. I mean, I was a bit amazed when I got this prize from this institution, because when I started out my career in bioethics in public in 1989, then of course I was threatened by the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Alf Svensson. He wanted me sacked, really. I had a position as associate professor at practice philosophy at Stockholm University, and he wanted me sacked. And also when Peter has been visiting us earlier on, there have been problems. At one, I think it was in the late 90s, where the Speaker of the Parliament refused you to enter the premises of the Swedish Parliament.
Really? Right.
Yes,
we were going to have a meeting within the Swedish Parliament, and then we had to move it outside.
Yeah, you had to move it outside.
Who was the Speaker of the Parliament?
Birgitta Dahl.
Oh, wow, that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, there has been strong attempts at cancelling me also, but now I got a prize from the same guys that wanted me then to not be around. So I think it's been a huge progress in that sense. We have a much more open, I think, intellectual situation now, at least with regard to that kind of sensitive topics that Peter and I have been discussing. There might be other examples now today.
Yeah, I mean, when
the cancelling culture is more...
Yeah, that's what I hear from academics in Sweden, that there are topics that, like transgender issues or biological gender differences, that is not accepted to discuss openly. You have to have a trigger warning, or using certain words you have to be trigger warned and so on.
Yeah,
so maybe they just
not only using certain words, because that might be reasonable. I don't think you should call anyone a Negro or so if it's...
No, that's not what I mean.
But the mention of the words.
That's what I mean.
Distinction between use and mention is important.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Not even the mention of these words.
With quotation marks, so to speak. Because there was this case in Uppsala where actually discussed how to search old texts for racist expressions. And you had to use the words in the teaching of how to search the archives on the, and that was objections from the students.
That's right. There was actually the one incident that in Princeton that happened like that was that there was a professor who was teaching a course which was about offense and language and things like that. And he used the N-word several times. He said things like, well, would you rather be called a N-word or be punched in the face? But he actually used the word rather than what I just did, right? And he did this several times, and some students said, would you stop doing this? And he said, well, it's part of the point of the course that I'm trying to get you to see to what extent, you know, a verbal thing causes offense as compared with physical violence, for instance. But the students all objected to this, and some of them marched out. He was actually, you know, and then it became discussed in the university. He was supported by the president of the university, who said, look, you know, this may be offensive, but we respect freedom of speech. But the lecturer himself decided that he didn't want to continue the course, that the atmosphere of the course in which the course was to be taught was now going to be too poisoned, if you like, and so he cancelled the course.
But isn't this a problem for the academic freedom?
Well, I think it can be a problem, yes, and I think, you know, there are certainly circumstances in which it has inhibited.
But on the other hand, I think it's sometimes a healthy phenomenon, even if those who protest are wrong often. If handled in an appropriate way, I think you could learn something from these confrontations and so. I remember the 70s, we had those conflicts again, and the left-wing persons objected to for example, to analytical philosophy. It's bourgeois and reactionary.
You were part of that, weren't you?
No, I wasn't, because I was always an analytical philosopher.
Okay, but you were part of the left-wing movement.
I was part of the left movement. Yeah, I'm still.
Yeah, you're still
part of the left-wing movement. But then Lars Bergström, as you know, my predecessor, very cleverly arranged with a seminar where we discussed whether analytic philosophy is bourgeois and reactionary or not. And then he wrote down this thesis. It is analytic philosophy is bourgeois and reactionary. And then he asked us to make more precise this claim.
Wonderful.
And the seminar went on during a semester, and most of the people who had protested either just deserted philosophy or became more interested in the subject in a more sensible way. So, I think often it should be met in this spirit.
It can be, but my experience, and you know, again, this is a relatively minor incident, but my experience is that the people don't want to discuss it. So I was at a dinner of students. There's like a discussion group of students who meet over dinner. Maybe there was 20 students in the room, and I was introducing a topic which was about exactly this, about freedom of discussion. And it did move to look at transgender issues, and I raised the question about the fact that in some countries now, the United Kingdom is one example, if you say that you're a woman, you sign a declaration, then legally you are a woman. And the one consequence of this has been that there have been people in women's prisons who have a physically unaltered, characteristically male body. In other words, they have testes and a penis. And there have been claims, and I'm not sure how well they're supported, that this has increased the amount of sexual assaults occurring in women's prison, which, you know, given that these people are in prisons, is not a very wouldn't be a surprising fact if it is true. As I say, it does need to be documented. So there was one woman in that room who was offended by this discussion, even because it was questioning. I suppose she saw it as questioning the idea that self-ID is enough to change gender. And after the meeting, she wrote to the president of the organization and said she wasn't going to attend any more meetings. So, when that happens, it's a pity, and then you don't have the learning experience that you would have by having that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, there are situations where you fail completely, but I think you shouldn't be too concerned with this. I mean, it's natural that there are conflicts, and sometimes they are irrational also, but don't try to rationalize them.
But I mean, the concern might not be relevant when it comes to the reactions of the students, but the concern is relevant when it comes to the reactions of the what you call it, the chair of the university, if they don't dare to deal with it. If they just sort of say, okay, we stop this course or whatever, we cancel this person. That's the problem, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is a problem, but you have to try to defeat also such structures, I think, judging from my own experience. Yes,
Peter, you mentioned earlier today in our seminar that in America, some person, maybe you should tell that story, some person who wanted to be trans race instead of transgender, that created a lot of reactions. And it's still, in a philosophical sense, the same thing.
Well, I'll tell the story. Whether it is in the philosophical sense the same thing or not is, of course, what's up for debate.
Yeah, okay.
But yes, there was a woman called Rachel Dolezal who worked for an organization that was helping African Americans, and she identified herself as African American. There were some things about her appearance which made that somewhat plausible, but it was then later shown that she had no African American ancestry, and she was vilified for having identified as African American. And the vilification came from essentially the same people who politically would say that if somebody who has a biologically male body identifies as a woman, then they are a woman, and you would be wrong to question their being a woman, and that would be a threat to their identity and naturally very upsetting for them. So there was an article published by a philosopher, young philosopher called Rebecca Tuvel, who just raised the question as to why is it that transracialism is regarded as wrong, whereas transgender is regarded as fine, and so much so that it shouldn't even be questioned. And that article itself was then attacked. It was published in a feminist journal called Hypatia, and about 800 academics signed a letter calling it on the editors to retract the paper, and saying that it shouldn't have been published. And there was a lot of personal attacks that Tuvel suffered, and she feared that her career might be at an end because of the opposition to her article. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but it was a very disturbing experience for her.
But they didn't retract it?
No, the editor refused to retract it, but actually there was then a move to change the whole editorial board and the editor, and I think that did happen at the journal. So although the article was never officially retracted, it certainly had consequences for the running of the journal.
And this is the reason why you and some others started the Journal of Controversial Ideas, right?
That's correct. That was one of the incidents. There were a number of others, but that was one of the incidents that led us to think that we should provide a forum for articles that are well argued, that are rigorous, where the evidence stands up, that pass through the normal academic peer review process, but that the authors would not want to put their name to. Or sometimes, that even if the authors did put their name, the editors of journals would not want to publish because they were too controversial. So we set up this open access journal called the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which anybody can find online by going to journalofcontroversialideas.org. And we have published one issue so far of 10 articles, which 3 were published under a pseudonym, which might not otherwise have been published. At least some of them, I'm sure, would not otherwise have been published, either because the author wouldn't want to put their name to it or because an editor wouldn't want to publish it. So we hope to continue that and to provide a forum where people can publish things that would otherwise be too controversial or that they wouldn't want to publish under their own name.
And you on the editorial board, you know who wrote these articles?
Not in all cases. No.
I mean, I've reviewed for the journal. It was not revealed to me the identity of the authors.
Yeah, but and in I think of the 3 that was published, there was certainly at least one where none of us on the editorial board either know the name.
So you can only judge it by its actual quality of the argument.
That's right.
But that's fine, isn't it?
That's fine in a way. I mean, I published with my name on it also. That is also allowed. I mean...
Yes.
So, Torbjörn, you published in this journal as well?
Yeah, in this first issue as well. Perhaps it was a way of cheating. I suppose I could have published that article in some other journal. It wasn't that controversial. But
what was it about?
Global heating, the future of humanity, global despotism, lifeboat ethics as a last exit for last way of avoiding exit of our species. So there were many of those ideas are controversial, of course, but not that controversial that they could not have appeared. I think.
Oh, we thought it belonged in the journal. We were happy to have it.
Okay, let me ask you both a little bit more personal questions. I mean, you both have had long and are having long careers in philosophy. What brought you into philosophy in the first place? Why did you become a philosopher? Who wants to start?
I can start if you like.
Yeah, sure.
It was actually an interesting series of accidents for me. So firstly, I'm not sure how it is in Sweden, but in Australia, if you want to do law or medicine, you do it straight out of high school. You don't, like in America, do an undergraduate bachelor's degree first. So when I finished high school, I applied to do law at university because my older sister had done law and it seemed interesting. She also, her then boyfriend, her later husband, was also a lawyer. So I applied to do law, and I was accepted by the law faculty, but I saw a university counsellor, which was then the practice, somebody from the law faculty. And he looked at my academic record, and he saw that I had done well in subjects like literature and history. There was no philosophy taught in high school then. And he said, you might find the law degree a little bit narrow. Why don't you combine it with an arts degree? You can do an arts law degree, Bachelor of Arts as well as Bachelor of Law, and it only takes a year or so longer. So I thought, yes, that sounds interesting, so I'll do that. So then I had to decide what I wanted to major in the undergraduate degree. You can do 2 subjects that you want to work in, and history was one of them because I'd enjoyed that and done well in it. But my sister's boyfriend had studied some philosophy as well, and I talked to him about philosophy, and that sounded interesting, and I knew very little about it. But I knew that I enjoyed a good argument. Maybe that was why I was wanting to be a lawyer. And so I thought, fine, I'll do philosophy. So,
what age were you in at that time?
18.
18, okay.
Yeah. So I started doing philosophy, and I did enjoy that, and I did well in it. So when I finished my BA, which was before I'd finished my law degree, I was offered a scholarship to do a master's degree in that. And
this was in Australia?
This was in Melbourne, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
And I decided to take that. I went to talk to the law faculty and I said, can I suspend my law studies? And they said, yes, fine, you can come back to it later if you like. But I completed the master's degree. I then got offered a scholarship to go to Oxford and do my graduate work there. For an Australian, that was very exciting, of course, to the thought of studying in such a famous and historic place. We don't have very much history in Australia. It doesn't, at least white history anyway, doesn't go back that far. So I took that up too, and then the story just went on from there. I did well in my Oxford studies too and got offered a job afterwards, so I never went back to the law degree.
Okay, and interesting. And for you, Torbjörn, what was starting your interest, igniting the flame?
I was really interested already in high school. I read Bertrand Russell and that kind of stuff. And Ingmar Hedenius, Against Religion and so. So I was really prepared for philosophy in a way. And then I thought high school was prison. And then when I started university, I started to study several subjects at once. We had a very free system then. You could just pick the courses you wanted. So I studied mathematics, I studied the history of literature, history of music, and philosophy altogether. But that was really, there was a personal experience that really drew me to philosophy. And that, I told this story, I think, many times. But
tell it again.
But I'll tell it again. My father was ill. It turned out he had a very aggressive liver cancer when I was in my late teens. And it soon turned out that he would only survive for a few additional months and so. And he took this with I mean, in the best manner you could. He tried to finalize his life and so in many ways. But then it turned out that it was so terrible, this disease. It hurt so enormously. So eventually he died in what you call terminal anguish or something like that. And on the way there, he asked his doctor for help to die. He wanted euthanasia, but his doctor said that no, it's even though they were friends, I can't help you. It is illegal. It's against medical ethics, the principles of medical ethics, and so. So he died in terrible pain at the very end, and I had to watch this together with my mother. At the same time, I was drafted for military services. And I was a pacifist then. I was already organized politically in a way. I was against the atomic bomb, and so I refused to do my military service. And they said, then you have to go to jail, because it's illegal not to kill other
to
people.
Be willing to kill, at least.
To be willing, at least. I mean, to train to kill other people. I found this confusing, absurd, really. My father, who wanted help to die when he really needed it, they refused it because it was not only illegal but immoral. But I was legally prescribed to do the same, to kill innocent, so people. So that drew me to moral philosophy, and since then, I've struggled with these questions as well as you. And we mentioned Jonathan Glover, a common friend who wrote this influential book, Causing Death and Saving Lives, that inspired me also later on. And
Jonathan Glover,
yes,
a philosopher. Where is
he was at Oxford. I think he must be retired by now.
He was then in London. But,
that's
now
right. Then
now he's retired. He's even older than we.
Okay. But he was an inspiration.
That book was a huge inspiration.
I remember reading your book, Torbjörn. What was it called? Du skall understundom döda.
Yes,
in Swedish.
Yes, first in Swedish. Then it exists now as a.
What's the English title?
The English title is Taking Life, The Ethics of Killing.
Right, I know that book.
Okay. But the Swedish title is better because it's referring to the god thou shall not kill.
Thou shalt
and
not
it's
kill.
it's not it's thou shall sometimes kill.
Thou shalt sometimes kill.
Thou shall
really
sometimes kill.
The best translation of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean that then came all sorts of problems in philosophy as well, of course, but this one has haunted me.
I can understand.
Yeah, I can imagine. I didn't know that about your father, which is very sad, of course, but it is a good example of why we really need to think better in moral philosophy.
Yeah. Have you had some kind of similar existential situation, Peter, that has affected your attitudes to philosophy or positions in philosophy?
I don't know that anything like that has really affected my positions in philosophy. I suppose finding out about how the animals that I was then eating, this is when I was a graduate student at Oxford, how they were being treated, and learning about conditions in factory farms, that would be the closest I could think of in terms of an experience that not only led me to change what I eat, but led me to take up this as a major issue in moral philosophy, the moral status of animals, which at that stage I hadn't really thought about very much, and I guess I had assumed, as most people did at that time, that no issue about animals could be anywhere near as important as an issue involving humans. So I now think of that as just, another example of the sort of prejudice we have against taking seriously the interests of non-human animals. But that would be the closest. I mean, I did have the experience of my mother declining through dementia, and eventually really ceasing to be, I think, a person at all. But that happened relatively late when I'd already formed my views about the fact that people should be able to choose when they want to die before that happened. So it didn't produce a dramatic change.
But you have a fascinating ancestor story. Your grandfather worked with Freud.
That's true, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So my grandfather lived in Vienna and was a student of the classics, of Latin and Greek. He taught Latin and Greek at a high-level academic high school in Vienna. And he attended some early lectures that Freud gave at the University of Vienna, and then wrote to Freud suggesting that he might like to apply his psychoanalytic techniques to some of the myths of ancient Greece and Rome, or perhaps to some of the folk stories of the cultures around Europe, particularly Southeastern Europe. And Freud welcomed this suggestion and invited him to come and talk to him, and suggested he join the Wednesday Circle, which was a discussion group of about 20 people that met in Freud's rooms. And they did then begin work on this paper, in which my grandfather supplied the raw material, the folk stories, and Freud psychoanalyzed them. But Freud did not publish the paper at the time because my grandfather sided with Alfred Adler in the split that occurred between Adler and Freud about how to understand psychoanalysis. My grandfather thought Freud was abominably authoritarian in suppressing any different ideas from his own. And so he joined with Adler. And none of the group who joined with Adler were ever spoken to by Freud again. So my grandfather wasn't. The paper was in my grandfather's possession, it appears. And it survived my grandparents' deportation during the Nazi period to Theresienstadt. And my grandfather died there, but my grandmother survived, returned to Vienna, and retrieved the paper, which she must have given to one of her non-Jewish friends, and brought it out to Australia. Eventually, it was drawn to the attention through my aunt of the Freud archive in New York, and they published it then initially as a separate volume, but now that paper is included within the Freud collected works.
Did you get to know your grandmother? I mean, she lived long enough for that?
I was 9 when she died, so I got to know her. Of course, I knew she was a warm and loving person, but I did not have intellectual conversations with her. My sister, who was 6 years older, did come closer to that. My grandmother was actually a mathematician. She was only the third woman to graduate in maths and sciences from the University of Vienna.
Wow.
And something like the 30th or 35th female graduate at all from the university. There's actually an interesting story about her with relation to women. She was the best mathematics student of her class, and the best student traditionally received a ring from the emperor Franz Josef, an engraved ring with a prize. But no woman had ever before received this honor, and it went to the Ministry of Education, who said that the prize can only be given to a man. So she did not receive the prize.
Incredible, incredible. So, but you never got to ask her how Freud was to talk with?
No. At the age of 9, I had no idea about any of that. I'm sorry.
No, but it's a fascinating story. What's your own personal view of the psychoanalysis theories? I mean, some people see it more like a religion than a science.
I have to say that, having read Freud subsequently after learning about the connection, but also, I guess, out of general interest, and also looking at this particular paper that my grandfather wrote with Freud, I don't think it's science, really. I think it's, it's a possible interpretation of why people do things, but it would need to be backed up with some further evidence, and that evidence doesn't seem to be there. No. And it's somewhat mechanical, I think, in its application of, everything has to be traced back to neuroses that relate to sexual desires and so on. And Alfred Adler, who had this idea that a lot of neurosis comes from a sense of inferiority, invented the term inferiority complex. That's a reasonable idea. That's as plausible as Freud's ideas. But Freud basically pushed it out of the mainstream psychoanalysis, and it would have been nice to have some kind of empirical test as to whether senses of inferiority are important or these suppressed sexual desires are important, but that was never done, I think.
But I think Freud made one scientific achievement, at least, and that's local anesthesia.
I didn't know that Freud discovered local anesthesia. Really?
I didn't know that.
No, I've heard it said by anestheticians. I don't know really how much truth there is to this myth.
But Torbjrn, what's your view of psychoanalysis?
No, I haven't studied it enough to really have a view on it. I tend to be skeptical, but often you're skeptical to things that might be more interesting.
I think if we want to be fair to Freud, we could say, apart from the particular causes of neuroses, the idea that there's something unconscious going on in our motivation, Freud, that's an important thought, and Freud may not have been the only one to think it, but he did help to promote that idea and to get more people thinking about, what unconscious desires or urges could be leading us to make certain choices.
And it's also fascinating, this idea that what you see going on here is, something very different is going on beneath it. It's also, you've written about Marx, and it's the same idea that a phenomena can be explained by something else going on, which is more ruthless and brutal in a way. So, when you think you hold a philosophical seminar and search for the truth, it's just a fight, a sexual fight.
Or part of your role in the class struggle. Or
yes. Yeah. Or you're in the class struggle. So I think those ideas are at least from a literary point of view, interesting.
And I think Marx is an interesting parallel, because I also don't think it's a scientific idea, right? Marx thought that he was a scientific socialist in contrast to the earlier utopian socialists like Robert Owen and Proudhon and so on. But I think, there was not really science in Marx either. It was a kind of a transformation of the Hegelian philosophy that he got as a student, and an interesting transformation. But not a scientific account that enables you to predict the outcome of history, as we've seen. Marx's predictions have failed.
Don't you think that that's some kind of almost biological instinct that we have to sort of have a theory of everything, like a theory that explains everything? Isn't that some kind of urge that a lot of people have, that we have as human?
Yeah, we should have it, I think.
Okay.
That's a good point of departure.
We should be self-critical about which theories we accept.
Yes,
exactly. Yeah,
it's a good point of departure when we do science, I think.
Okay, well, and just one more theme that I want to discuss with you. Fast forward now from from what we talked about to maybe the future. I mean, we have a scientific revolution in neuroscience, I would say. I mean, our understanding of the brain is developing very fast, and we can scan the brain and see things happening. Do you think that this could lead to new ideas in moral philosophy? I mean, neurophilosophy, sort of mixing brain imaging with moral dilemmas and so on. Can you learn something as a philosopher from studying the brain in that way?
Perhaps, I mean, you've been perhaps even deeper into this than I have been, but I mean, there is one application, of course, that's interesting, and it has to do with the debunking strategies of moral ideas, where you use all sorts of scientific, psychological and neurological resources to as I see, to sort out those ideas that you could trust on, those moral intuitions that are trustworthy, that you should, if they conflict with the theory, you should give up on the theory and you should use it as input, like you do with observations in science. But only if some of them are reliable in this sense. And then this science could perhaps help you to sort those who are reliable and those who are not reliable. But then you have also the metaethical idea here that we have to debunk every moral view because of those findings. Neither Peter nor I accept that skeptical application of these techniques, but at least, I mean, it could help us to get rid of some of our ideas, but I don't think it could ever inform us about which is the correct moral theory. It's again the simple distinction here between is and ought.
Hume's naturalistic fallacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but I agree. I think it's interesting, and one example that I have been involved in is the study of the trolley problem. The famous example where, in one version, you are standing by a switch, and there's a runaway trolley or train that's going down the tracks, and it's heading for 5 people and will kill them, but you can throw the switch and it will kill only 1. And most people, when you say, should you throw the switch, about 85% of people will say, yes, you should throw the switch. But in what seems to be in some ways a similar situation where you don't have a switch, but you're standing on a footbridge, and again, there's the runaway train, and it's going to kill 5 people. But there's a very heavy person leaning over looking at the track, and if you just give him a bit of a shove, he'll fall onto the track, and he's so heavy that he will stop the trolley, killing the 5 people. So again, 1 dies, but 5 don't. But almost everybody says, no, you mustn't do that, right? You mustn't push the one person.
But the outcome is equal.
The outcome, in both cases, 1 person gets killed and 5 people live. And so Josh Green, who was originally a philosophy PhD at Princeton when I first came to Princeton, but is now a professor of psychology at Harvard, had the idea of asking people about the trolley problem while taking images of their brains to see what parts of their brains were most active. And he found that in those, when you asked them about the switch problem, there was mostly sort of cognitive parts of the brain involved in cognitive activities that were active. But when you asked them about the footbridge case, it was mostly parts of the brain that are more involved with emotional responses. And he thought that, therefore, there is an explanation for this difference, which is not a sort of explanation within moral philosophy that one is right and one is wrong, but rather is the fact that when you think about pushing someone with your hands to their death, this produces an emotional response, whereas when you think about throwing a switch, it doesn't. And there's a possible explanation for that, and we're sitting here looking at a photograph of Charles Darwin, and it may be that, after all, for all of our evolutionary history, we had the possibilities of killing people with our bare hands, perhaps pushing them off cliffs, but perhaps just, physical violence. Whereas it's only for the last 100 years or two that we've had the possibility of killing people by throwing a switch. So the switch is much more neutral and allows our cognitive activities to take account of the fact, well, there's 5 people and then there's 1 person, it's better that only 1 die. But when asked to push somebody, all of those inherited visceral responses that helped us to survive as a social group from hundreds of thousands of years override the cognitive responses. So that's an example of what Torbjörn meant by a debunking explanation. It debunks the idea that it's somehow worse to push the person off the bridge, which in any case seemed a little bit strange, but some philosophers tried to explain it and justify it. But really it may be that we don't want to justify it because it's just part of our evolutionary past, and when we really think about the issue and apply our reasoning, we can see that they're parallel.
Yeah, yeah.
Which means also that there could be good reasons, moral reasons, to be a person who has difficulty with
oh yes, in general, we would want people to have inhibitions.
Yeah. So there are good reasons to have that response. But when you realize that it is this kind of quick thinking, then you should perhaps lose your it's not credible as a intuition to build a theory on. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the other reaction, if you have, do you have that picture? Does it strike you as immediately right to push this big person, or do you share my reluctance also?
Look, I think we want people to be reluctant about pushing someone to their death.
Yeah.
That's true, but I do think that when I think calmly about this in a theoretical sense, I think it would be the right thing to do. I think if you knew that this was the only way to save 5 people and you could do it, if you were the kind of person who could do it, I think it would be the right thing to do.
I agree, of course, but I wouldn't. But I don't have an intuition here that it is right. I think could support my theory. When I say that it's right, I deduce this conclusion from my utilitarian beliefs, as does those I think who know that it would bring too much complication to the argument.
Okay, but what you're saying is that your intuitions would probably stop you from doing it anyway, but you think rationally that it's the right thing to do.
The intuition doesn't stop me from doing anything. That the content of an intuition is proposition. Okay. This is right, this is wrong. Okay. Like the content of an observation is this is there is a proton or something like that. But my intuition is also an event, of course, a mental event. And I think the mechanism here producing this mental event with this content is a kind of quick thinking that we have, because in most cases it takes us in the right direction. But now when we want to assess this thought experiment to tease out which theory is the correct one, we can't rely on it. You could compare with your fear of snakes. I mean, it's a good idea to fear all snakes because some of them are poisonous. But if you want to decide whether a particular snake is poisonous or not, then it's not a good idea to rely on this mechanism.
Well, it's better to avoid all snakes than to take the risk of meeting a poisonous.
Right. But if you actually know that a snake is not poisonous, you might still have the instinctive reaction. It's still a snake. It still wiggles that way. You might still be fearful of it. But if you really know it's not poisonous, then it's okay if you want to examine it or pick it up or something.
Okay, one final question, a small question. Do you believe in free will?
Small question.
What's your position on
I think this is the most difficult problem in philosophy, perhaps. But I have fairly recently published an article together with Maria Svedberg on the topic, and where we defend this rather old-fashioned G. Moorian idea that you have free will in the sense that had you decided to act differently in the situation, you would have done so. Then you could have done it. I mean, what does it mean that you could have acted otherwise? It means that if you had decided to act otherwise, you would have done it. This seems rather straightforward and easy to accept, but it means, of course, that had you acted differently in this situation and determinism is true, then either the past would have been different or the laws of nature would have been different. So that's what you have to accept when you accept this idea. But if you don't accept it, then take utilitarianism, for example. If we have no alternatives to our actions, that all actions are right. So much is at stake here, I think.
Much is at stake. What do you say, Peter?
I'm not sure why you say all actions are right if we have no alternatives.
I mean the only way of acting wrongly, I think, is to do something where you could have done something with better consequences. If that is never the case, then you're safe. You can't act. No.
Well, you could say that you can't do something wrong, but it's not the case that your actions are right.
Well, I think if an action is not wrong, then it's right. It's almost a conceptual truth, I would say, or at least I accept it in my moral arguments.
I would put it rather this way, that if your actions have good consequences, then those were the right actions for you to do. That doesn't mean that you deserve to be praised for them, because you may have done them without choosing. It may not have come through your choice. There may have been other influences. But when we think about praising or blaming the agent, then we should think about what you're talking about. What did the agent choose? Did the agent choose to do this? Why did the agent choose to do this? We might want to know about their motivations as well. So we might praise them if they chose to do it because they were saving an innocent person from drowning, but then we discover that they knew that this was the child of a billionaire and that they expected to get rewarded, and they wouldn't have done it otherwise. So
I think I have a much more simple idea about praise and blame also. I think we should praise a person if it has the best consequences of doing so. Otherwise, you should not do it. So that these are just actions like other actions, praising and blaming and so. But the basic problem here, whether or not action is right or wrong, seems to... it can't be wrong unless there are alternatives to our actions. So can't you say free will or free... It's not really a matter of free will, I think. It's a matter of being able to act otherwise from how you do, that there are alternatives to your actions. If there are no alternatives to your actions, then I think it follows from the criterion of right action that we operate with, we utilitarians, that all actions are right.
But the question of what is an alternative, so because on the view that you're defending, which I'm not actually disagreeing with the view about free will, but it does follow that if you knew all the relevant facts beforehand and you knew the right laws of nature, you would be able to predict the way that you were going to act, right? Which would mean predicting what you would choose and then predicting your action. So some people would say, if that's true, then I didn't really have an alternative. It was predetermined that I was going to make this choice. So I think that gets back to the point.
But this notion of free will is not incompatible with this. I mean, it could still be true that if you had made another decision, you would have acted otherwise. Right. Of course, you never act otherwise from how you actually act. And that could be determined. But still, there is room, I think, for free action in this Morian sense.
In this particular sense of
even though it has these rather spectacular consequences that had you acted otherwise from how you did, then either the past would have been different or the laws of nature would have been different.
Yes.
What's your point, Peter, when it comes to, do we have free will?
So I also hold the view that freedom in the relevant sense is compatible with determinism, and it is compatible with the idea that a perfect knower would be able to predict how you would choose and therefore what your actions would be. I think this means that you have freedom in the relevant sense, which means that you can be appropriately blamed for what you do because that may alter your choices. I think again, I don't disagree with Torbjörn's idea that praise and blame are actions that have consequences, but we appropriately praise and blame somewhere where doing that could influence their choices or their future choices or the choices of other people who are aware of our praise and blame. And that therefore becomes another causal factor in how people are going to choose.
Okay.
But still, I would say there is some room also for blameless wrongdoing and for blameful right doing. And at least I have written about
Yeah,
such
I think
cases.
there are such cases, I agree.
Okay, that's very good. So, Peter, you're going back to Australia now tomorrow, right?
I'm now going on Monday just because of a flight got cancelled, so I couldn't make
But back to Australia, and you have summer there right now.
I will have, yes, that's right.
That's wonderful. Torbjörn and I have to stick with the Swedish winter.
Yeah.
Okay, Torbjörn Tännsjö, Peter Singer, thank you for being in the Fri Tanke podcast.
It's
Thank
been
you.
my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome.